Hello. Thank you all for joining us today. The Glendale Environmental Coalition originated out of a campaign for clean energy in Glendale, and its advocacy efforts have continued to focus on energy and climate issues, as well as waste and plastics, and transportation, walkability, and open space. We recognize that some environmental harms affect different members of our community more than others, and those issues may not get the same attention in environmental advocacy as other issues, even though they pose just as great a threat to people and the planet. The impetus for this panel was to understand environmental concerns that most directly affect people in different parts of Glendale and from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, as well as an effort to broaden our vision of environmental activism. We're very excited to have such a strong turnout. I want to take special note of our co-sponsors and thank them for their partnership in this event. Adams Hill Neighborhood Association, represented by Arlene Vidor, Stephen Meek, and Patty Silvashir. Armenian Engineers and Scientists of America, represented by Dr. Ara Chichian. Black in Glendale, represented by co-founder Tanita Harris-Ligons, who is also one of our distinguished panelists this afternoon. Civic Sundays, represented by local and national political activist Elizabeth Vitanza. Coalition for an Anti-Racist Glendale and YWCA Glendale, represented by Tara Peterson. Glendale Parks and Open Space Foundation, represented by President Michelle Michikian. League of Women Voters of Los Angeles, represented by Executive Director Marilu Guevara. The Verdugo Hills Group of the Sierra Club, represented by David Eisenberg, who is also a steering committee member of GEC. I'll say a bit more about him in a moment. Volunteers Organized in Conserving the Environment, represented by Paul Rabinoff, who is a steering committee member of GEC as well. We want to briefly mention the continuing crisis in Artsakh. GEC wishes to express its support for the members of our local community with connections to Artsakh and Armenia, and reiterate that we stand in solidarity with the people there and hope for lasting peace. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge David Eisenberg, who is our resourceful technical expert responsible for making this event stream and operate seamlessly, and my colleagues Kathy Kataris, who months ago had the vision to propose this event, and Kate Unger, another key member of GEC's steering committee, and who both were my steadfast partners in bringing this event into fruition, as well as the rest of the GEC steering committee, who has been instrumental in sharing the details of this event with the community and reaching out to all of our various co-sponsors. Without them, this event would not be possible. And of course, we are very honored to have with us this afternoon an incredible panel of distinguished local activists here in Glendale, who we will be introducing momentarily. Lastly, we are very privileged to have with us this afternoon as our moderator, Dr. Michael Méndez, Assistant Professor of Environmental Policy and Planning at the University of California, Irvine. He previously was the inaugural James and Mary Pinchot Faculty Fellow in Sustainability Studies at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Dr. Méndez has more than a decade of senior level experience in the public and private sectors, where he consulted and actively engaged in the policymaking process. This included working for the California State Legislature as a senior consultant, lobbyist, gubernatorial appointee, and as a vice chair of the Sacramento City Planning Commission. Dr. Méndez holds 3 degrees in environmental planning and policy, including a PhD from UC Berkeley's Department of City and Regional Planning and a graduate degree from MIT. His research on the intersection of climate change and communities of color has been featured in national publications, including Urban Land, the Natural Resources Defense Fund Annual Report, the American Planning Association's Planning Magazine, Green 2.0 Leadership at Work, USA Today, and Fox Latino News. His new book, Climate Change from the Streets, published in 2020, is an urgent and timely story of the contentious politics of incorporating environmental justice into global climate change policy. And with that, I'm going to pass the virtual lectern over to Dr. Michael Méndez.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jane, for that generous introduction. It's quite a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to the Glendale Environmental Coalition for their work locally in the city of Glendale and regionally, advancing more equitable environmental solutions within the city and for all community residents. Honored to be here today with a very distinguished panel of community advocates working to improve the quality of life within Glendale. Before we jump into our panel discussion and I'll moderate our Q&A session, I was asked to provide a general background on environmental justice and climate justice. So let me begin with that, and I'm going to spend about 5 or so minutes on that sort of general background. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So I wanted to start with this picture. I was having a conversation with one of the panelists earlier about this divide between the mainstream or traditional environmental movement and what is thought of the environmental justice movement, what is a social civil rights movement primarily led by people of color. And this brought me to remember an image that I came across in my own research in my book about 10 years ago in Oakland. Oakland, California is one of my major sites, predominantly city of people of color, 2/3 of people of color in that area at the time. And there was a lot of discussion back then, early on in the times, about climate change, how it didn't relate to the local scale, didn't relate to the human dimension or human side of what climate change meant. And it had like these often what had become a tired trope of saving the polar bears. So that's reflective on this community flyer that was organizing the youth population within the city of Oakland to focus on climate change and acknowledging that it's not just about polar bears, but climate justice is about people. It's about youth. It's about centering low-income people of color. And there's a great quote that I did in that interview that became part of my book. By Brian Beveridge. Until the last decade, climate change tended to be a white, affluent issue about saving the rainforest and polar bears. It hasn't had deep relevance for people trying every day to get by in the urban centers. Most of the messages of climate change are about eliminating global greenhouse gases and not about people. And this was 10 years ago. And a lot has changed in those 10 years about centering people, particularly people living on the fence line of pollution. And my book, it really focuses on this. And 10 years later now in California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis and historic racial unrest. In the last 4 months, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters: fires, blackouts, heat waves, droughts, hazardous air quality, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These are all major life events. 5 of the 10 largest wildfires by acreage in California's history burned this year alone. These compounding of the disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequalities, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. To address the climate emergency, activists and policymakers in recent years have proposed the Green New Deal at the federal level, which many of you may know as a radical proposal to decarbonize our economy and address poverty and inequality. However, for the last 2 decades, low-income communities of color have also pushed state and local governments to experiment with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and approaches that also address inequality and public health. These efforts in climate experimentation have been contentious and are often met with significant resistance. While I'm very supportive of the Green New Deal, I'm also here to say there's nothing new about the Green New Deal. Climate change experiments in places like here in California, here in Glendale, and throughout Los Angeles since the 2006 have been all-out street fights. Environmental justice activists are often pitted against traditional environmentalists who often favor the least costly mitigation solutions, which do not necessarily maximize equity and public health outcomes in low-income communities of color. Therefore, in my book, Climate Change from the Streets, I examine the politics and worldviews of climate change and environmental justice policymaking. My book foregrounds people, place, and power in the context of climate change and inequality. Although we often see and acknowledge science, the science of climate change as being clear, policy decisions about how to respond to its effects remain contentious. Even when such decisions claim to be guided by objective knowledge, they are made and implemented through political institutions and relationships and all the competing interests, power struggles, and racial dynamics that this implies. In my book, I present a narrative that describes the conflicts about climate change at its core as being cultural. California is often seen as a homogeneous entity that uniformly values environmentalism and climate action. This image universalizes the idea of climate change and detaches it from its cultural settings. It also obscures how we think about climate change at the local level. It often comes into conflict from other types of ideas of how to move forward with climate change. So using an example of California, my book examines the culturally contingent nature of climate change, the assumptions and the worldviews that often create conflict between community understandings of environmental conditions and the prevailing global top-down approaches to the conceptualization of climate change. And I argue and I show throughout the book how there's a reoccurring process of conflict and collaboration, where a broad range of individuals, including activists and organizations, are co-producing what climate change and environmental justice means. So I'm going to skip a little forward and talk a little bit about the history of environmental justice. Environmental justice was first seen to really come to the national forefront. In 1982, in Warren County, North Carolina, Warren County was a predominantly African-American community that came together along with strong leaders from the civil rights movement to protest the siting of a hazardous waste dump that was being proposed for that area. They created a lot of die-ins, as you see here, and protests, and this gained national media attention and introduced society, American society, to the environmental justice movement. They ultimately lost that fight, and the hazardous waste dump was still cited, unfortunately, in that area, but it created the impetus for what we know as now the modern environmental justice movement, which again came from long histories and tactics and organizing methods found in the civil rights movements. This also led to groundbreaking research. Toxic waste and race in 1987 was one of the first federal government and nonprofit reports that showed a direct correlation between race and the citing of hazardous waste dumps, independent of income and class. So this led to various definitions of environmental justice. An official definition, as we see from the US EPA, that really looks at the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policy. And then other definitions from individuals like Professor Bryant that looks at more holistic, looking at cultural norms and values, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that the environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. Both definitions are equally valid and are underpinned by the idea of environmental racism. Again, this idea that low-income people of color are intentionally targeted for these hazardous waste dumps, other types of environmental exposures. And this is done systematically throughout our system. Within the framework of environmental justice are four key types of justice. The first is procedural justice, the idea that all people, regardless of their race, color, or sexuality or gender, can participate in the policy and regulatory process to control pollution and exposure to pollution. So to be able to participate in the democratic process. The second is distributed justice, the idea that that environmental bags and environmental goods are equally distributed throughout society, and individual communities are not be considered sacrifice zones for all these environmental ills that are happening from our carbon intense and industrial processes. The third is recognition justice. Before you can have procedural justice or distributive justice, there must be a recognition of environmental racism, of the historic and systematic inequities that low-income people of color have faced, and understanding that and leading with that acknowledgement. And once that is acknowledged, that policy should center people of color, low-income people of color in particular, ensuring that they are safeguarded first. And then the final concept of environmental justice is this idea of capabilities justice. To fully be a full member of society in a democratic society, you not only need recognition, procedural or distributive, you also have to provide them with all the capabilities in society, such as housing, education, good jobs, healthcare, for they could be full active members of society, for they can participate democratically in some of these procedural decisions and ensuring that there's equal distribution of environmental goods and bads in society. So really looking at that wholeness, the whole society of approach. So those are the 4 ideas of environmental justice. And then the last 2 points I'd like to make, the environmental justice movement has been instrumental throughout history in disrupting the idea of what environment is considered. In particular for mainstream environmental groups such as the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and the Natural Resources Defense Fund, in their initial years would only focus on the environment and nature out there. But not nature in your own backyard, not acknowledging that nature is included in the city and that we should put all our resources within that, and ensuring that these environmental movements were also diverse and had people of color leading these movements and making some of these decisions. Therefore, they were able to disrupt this sort of dichotomy between what is nature and what is not nature. In the early years, environmental issues were only considered such as climate change, natural resource conservation, some forms of pollution, species protection, and issues of overpopulation. The environmental justice movement has moved forward in expanding that to address issues of inequality, social equity, and also those capabilities of linking, understanding what is the intersection between the environment, the built environment, jobs, housing, our public health, and racial and sexual inequality. So with that, that was a really brief synopsis of environmental justice and history and its relationship to climate change. So now I'm excited to move forward with everyone's here to listen to this distinguished panel of guests that are all going to speak about their perspectives on environmental racism in the context of climate change, in particular in the context of Glendale, California. So we have 4 guests, and I'm going to do an introduction to each guest as I ask the question. So the first question is going to go to Tanita Harris-Ligons. I hope I'm saying it right. Please correct me. She's the co-founder of Black in Glendale. And she's a community organizer, wellness lifestyle consultant, and an advocate for the preservation of African culture, healing, and performing arts. Her 25 years of experience in grassroots organizing includes extensive work and leadership with the Gang Peace Council of Pittsburgh, the Urban League, and the NAACP, and GLTV, which is Get Out the Vote. She's the creator of the Move Live dance and the co-founder and curator of Black in Glendale. Both organizations work to establish a network as a gateway of shifting hearts, mindsets, consciousness, and narratives to enable effective and sustainable communication. And also, she's one of the main leaders, as many of you know, to getting the Glendale City Council to address the sundown ordinance that was adopted many years ago. So my first question for you is to talk to us a little bit about how is climate change a racial justice issue? If you care about civil rights, Black Lives Matters movement, why should this also be connected with the climate change movement as well? And thank you and welcome to our conversation.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for that introduction. Environmental justice is intersects. Racial justice is environmental justice. The environments where people of color live, where Black folks and others live, have been affected in many ways. We don't have to look far. We know about Flint, but then there's the other communities that are affected. We could go way back to the civil rights movement because the civil rights movement came out of environmental injustice. You know, being able to get on a bus and ride comfortably is an environmental justice issue. It affects our environment, how people get back and forth to work. That affects our environment. So we can go as basic as that, or we can come current. like I said, the Black Lives Matter movement, or even the Sundown Town Resolution, because there is a direct correlation you can see between sundown towns, if you look around the country, different sundown towns, and how Black people are treated in those neighborhoods, whether they were former sundown towns or not, but in particular, those that were sundown towns, you'll see some correlations. And what I mean is, they might be sundown towns that are now gentrified, or they could be sundown towns that are still very Black. And so you can go into places like Sand Branch, Texas, the water crisis in Sand Branch, Texas, where the water has been contaminated for almost over a century. And it's a Black community there. So you don't have to look very far. If you dig a little, you'll see the connections between environmental and racial justice. Is, pretty much simple as that.
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate that acknowledgement about understanding how racial justice issues permeates every aspect of our society. If it's our criminal justice system, to our public health system, to our education, and of course to our environment, which includes multiple aspects. So I really appreciate that idea that racial injustice is embodied in multiple parts of our society. So thank you for that. And we'll be coming back to that more next. Next, I'd like to introduce Ash Rosas, a former hub coordinator for the Sunrise Movement LA. She's an 18-year-old college student and an environmental activist. Yay. She began her activism with the Glendale Environmental Coalition, fight to prevent the finalization of the Grayson Power Plant. She went on to become a hub coordinator and trainer for Sunrise Movement in Los Angeles. She currently is working on a climate policy recommendation in regards to 2,500-foot buffer zones on oil drilling and homes, and a very important issue to the environmental justice movement. Ash, so thank you for your participation here today and all the work that you're doing that grew out of Glendale, and it's moving on beyond Glendale as well. My question for you to start off is the Sunrise Movement, and you being Generation Y, correct, and being the youth population, and what aspects and perspectives do you fresh perspectives do you bring to the movement, and that's important to the climate justice movement, and for both nationally, but also within Glendale. So what does the youth movement bring to this discussion and the perspective?
Yeah, thank you for my introduction. Well, I think there are a few things. And one of the most important, I feel like, for at least me, is that my generation has the most to lose. We're going to be we have been experiencing the beginning of climate change. In my mid-30s, I'm going to be seeing the beginning of the full capacity of what climate change can do. And then I'll be living throughout the whole, well, I hope to, well, maybe not hope to, I don't know, to be experiencing, I'll be experiencing the sort of the downside, I guess, of climate change in general. And it's also important to recognize that the youth, my generation, we are going to be the ones holding, we are the ones that are going to be becoming scientists and holding office and all these things that we aren't right now. So the fact that we as young people are having to step up and having to say, you know, certain things aren't right. Like me right now at this age, I should be probably studying and enjoying my teens and living my life, but I have to do this because there are alternatives to climate change. Like we can make better choices as a city, as a nation, as a world that are equitable, that are just better, as a simpler term. And, you know, even as an 18-year-old, I know that there are people even younger than I am fighting for a better future, which is like a bit surprising because I feel like I'm pretty young right now. And what we know is that what millennials have been told is that someone will fix it. I remember having a conversation with a millennial, and growing up, he was told, someone will fix it, someone will fix it. And I guess my generation at this time has been like, we've been hearing that, and we know that accountability is so valuable and so necessary. And that's why a lot of us are out there training, like fighting for our lives and our futures. So that's sort of the perspective that we have.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that very passionate and opening about your motivation and the courage that you're having as a young person to take this fight to the streets and to the city halls and to Washington, D.C. So I applaud you for that work. And next, I'd like to introduce our third panelist, Alek Bartrosouf. I'm so bad with a lot. Bartrosouf. I have a little stutter, sorry. He's the co-founder of Walk Bike Glendale. He's a Glendale native working as an urban planner. After obtaining a psychology degree from UC Santa Cruz, he pursued sustainability, forming a grassroots group called Coalition for Green Glendale. The group helped form the city's 3 community-run gardens, helped advocate for Glendale's plastic bag ordinance, and worked with staff and elected officials to pursue environmental initiatives. Alek then pursued a master's degree in urban planning from UCLA and has since worked for nonprofit organizations and various government agencies. He now works as for Los Angeles City Council member Mike Bonin's transportation deputy. So he brings a wealth of knowledge and one of the co-founders of Walk Bike Glendale. So thank you for speaking with us today, Alek. My question for you is the field of urban planning, which you're an expert in of how we plan our cities. And environmental justice has long showed a systematic disinvestment in our communities, particularly communities of color. My question to you, how has the field of urban planning has been a tool for racial injustice?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. Thank you for moderating the panel, and thank you to GEC. It's amazing to see where we've come. Just 15 years ago, when I started this little tiny group called Coalition for Green Glendale, I would have never imagined that we would come this far. So thank you for providing this platform to talk about these very important issues. For me, as an urban planner, I have a very particular lens on. And that is to help shed light on what the built environment is and how it has come to be, and how it can be an opportunity to implement or subconsciously have environmental injustices in our communities. And it's interesting for Glendale because, Grayson aside, we don't have a coal burning power plant in our neighborhood that is emitting soot that we are visibly able to see. We don't have industries that are toxic, polluting our rivers and streams, our oceans. It's not blatantly visible to us how environmental injustice it is in our city. And I want to shed light on all the ways in which it has happened over decades, all the ways in which the city makes decisions on a daily basis that can contribute or reverse environmental injustices in our community. So I'm happy to bring that perspective to the conversation and give a little bit more concrete examples to what that looks like. But effectively, we do want to talk about equity and access for our various neighborhoods in our city and how it affects us as we go about our day in the community. So I'm happy to bring that perspective and talk about that further.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that and getting a little bit more about your expertise of specific problems and solutions related to the urban environment. So I'd like to start with Ash. Next question. Well, I encourage you, everyone in the audience, to send your questions through the Q&A function, and the panelists will be able to answer your individual questions. So please send them through the Q&A. Ash, I'd like to ask you the first question. Being part of the Sunrise Movement, there has been a big push over the last 4 years of the Trump administration to have a stronger focus on climate justice and the Green New Deal. Could you tell me, what are your hopes now for a Biden administration, and what can that mean for Glendale and the Los Angeles region?
Sure. I know that Sunrise, at least the Sunrise Movement, when the primaries were occurring, we did endorse Bernie Sanders because of the strong climate policy. Given that we now have President-elect Joe Biden, I feel very fortunate that he at least took into account a stronger platform, and especially because the people that worked on his climate policy platform were people that also worked on Bernie's. And I think that collaboration was really important for us as the Sunrise Movement, because, as you mentioned earlier, climate justice is not just environmental policies, it's also a factor of like different aspects of life, like health, education. But given that the new administration is coming forward with a new platform, I think it's a really important one, especially because it gives us more of an opportunity to take advantage of the resources that President-elect Joe Biden is going to give. Right now, I know Trump has limited a lot more resources. There aren't as many as we'd want, and there probably will be more policies coming forward that we can work with. And something that I know that we mentioned is that I know Joe Biden is not just going to be, we're not just electing him and then we're going to leave him be. It's also public pressure as well. Not everything is solid. And given that his policies, I have to go through them again because I read them, but I think that can you repeat the last part of the question?
What can the win of the Biden administration mean for Glendale locally as well, too?
I think that being empowered. We're talking about someone who probably at least believes in climate change, and Trump, his power to potentially destroy like the EPA and give an advantage to fossil fuel companies was really detrimental, and it still is. And here in Glendale, something that I think that I really admire is the fact that we are moving forward as a city for more green and efficient energy. So I hope that answered the question.
Sure, no, that's great. And I think a key point is the hope. And I want to congratulate you and everyone else on our webinar today, and our environment and our communities for the win of being able to pick leaders that support climate change and our environmental justice issues, and the historicness of the Biden transition team that had, as you mentioned, had key members of environmental justice groups, as well as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez supporters, on deciding what that platform for the Biden climate action plan should be. So great hope for us at multiple levels, not just at the federal, but at the local level. We have, Tanita, we have a question from the audience. And the question is, how do you fight greenwashing and fake justice solutions? You're on mute. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
There we go. I was just looking at that question. Well, one, we do our homework. So we research and we do our homework. one of the things that's really important, and the reason why I'm here today, most importantly, is because I can tell you in in our community, in the Black community, just like you said, save the polar bears. What I can remember the most growing up was like save the whales, when you talked about environmental justice. And we probably went as far as to think about it, maybe more so as limiting as recycling, just recycling, cleaning up, picking up trash. While that's important, that's major, recycling is major, it's bigger than that, right? It's how it affects our environment, our children who have high rates of asthma, or just our community overall, high rates of asthma because of the air conditions in the communities. And you really have to research and look into what's really happening in your community. In North Carolina, a lot of people didn't know that the hog farms were affecting the community. People were dying, having different forms of very irregular forms of cancer. I mean, cancer is irregular on its own, but just abnormal rates of cancer in the community. When things like that are happening, that's a red flag, and that's an opportunity for our community to say, hold on here, too much of this is happening. This isn't fake news here, this is real. I'm experiencing this. I'm seeing people around me who are sick. That's what, the Aaron Brockoviches and all that those stories are about. And so, or the fact that our infant mortality rates, we still can't get that right. We've been doing infant mortality rates in the Black community have been the highest since I've been in high school. I studied that in high school. I graduated high school in 1992, and we still have the same issue now. That's a problem. That's how that's how you fight that kind of, falsehoods. You get in there, you roll your sleeves up, and you get involved beyond what you hear, what's the hearsay. So that's important, and also you get involved by spreading the story. Spreading the information by any means necessary. A lot of people didn't understand what was happening in our environment until they watched the movie Aaron Brockovich. You don't see a lot of Black Aaron Brockovich. You don't see it's happening, but you don't see that inside. So movies, books, us telling the story, the community storytellers, is important that we include the truth, that we include our experiences, and our experiences are part of the research.
Great, thank you for that. No, that I think this idea of staying active, being alert, being informed, the power of social movements, the power of protest. And you mentioned addressing structural inequality. Systemic change is important, not these sort of astroturf type of approaches that really doesn't change anything in our society or change those rates of low birth rates of African-American children. Women as well. So next, I'd like to ask everyone this question, but I'm going to, of course, lead with Alek. Desiree has a question. Can each of the panelists list 2 or 3 top issues in Glendale you believe can have the greatest positive impact on directing the city down the path of greater environmental justice? So what are the 2 or 3 things that you think can help move forward environmental justice within Glendale?
Sure. So hi, Desiree. Thank you for asking the question. And I think it's important to talk about. I think for me specifically, based on my background and what I've seen in the city for the many years that I've lived here, the number one issue for me, I'll only mention one. The number one issue for me is transportation. Our need to get around the city, to get home, to get to work, to do our errands is essential for us. It's a daily activity. It's a daily behavior that we all experience in one form or another. The city and the region as a whole has always, or for many decades, has prioritized the automobile to get around. So, to touch on the greenwashing that we had talked about, the 90s version of greenwashing was to recycle that Coke bottle. I think today's version of that greenwashing is to buy an electric car. And, you know, talk about environmental injustice. Not everybody has $40,000, $50,000 to buy an electric car. We need to provide as a city, as the decision makers that have the weight and the ability and the funding and the resources to put together a comprehensive transportation strategy that provides people options. So to this day, in the city of Glendale, we do not have options to get around other than to get in our car. It is plain and simple. When I needed to get to City Hall in downtown LA, I live right off of Glendale Avenue. It takes me an hour by bus to get there. If I wanted to take the commuter express, which is on the outskirts of the city off the 2 freeway, I need to bike there, and it's a mile away from my house with no bike lanes whatsoever. So I'm taking my risk, you know, a risk of my life to get to this commuter express, which will shave my commute down by 20 minutes. I'm driving my car, or I'm taking the bus, which is miserable, not because of the services it provides, it's just that it's infrequent. There are not many route options in the city of Glendale. And why? You know, why are we not providing these amenities to give people the simple option not have to get in their car? So there's something to be said about density. A lot of people in the city do not want to talk about density. It's environmentalism is often used as a guide to not want density because it affects our built environment, it impacts access to open space. But the reality of it is the more dense a city is, the less likely it is a need for you to get in your car to go to the grocery store. You're more likely to be able to walk to the things you need to walk to. And as a city and as a, quite frankly, a NIMBY community that we are in, that is reflected in our council, we resist what is easy to accomplish and easy to benefit from an environmental justice perspective. And I'll just share real quick, I'll share my screen very briefly, simply to demonstrate to you what it is that we're combating in the transportation realm. So the green lines that you're seeing are the existing bike lanes in the city of Glendale. Don't mind the dashed lines, those are just bike routes that in reality don't mean anything to anybody that is looking for a meaningful way to get around. So you can see on this map, one bike lane does not connect to another bike lane. In fact, there's only one instance of that, and that's at Sonora and Glen Oaks. There is no network of bike lanes that get people to where they want to go. We've been tackling this for years. The city has had a bicycle master plan on the books for a very long time. Implementation has been slow, if any. And this just goes to show you that we are not prioritizing providing options for people to get around. And this bleeds into environmental injustice because there are people that simply don't have the resources to own a car. They live in the denser parts of the city that, you know, may be difficult to find access to parking, which is in itself expensive. Don't have the resources to afford a vehicle. Or even, we could even talk about sidewalks. A lot of sidewalks are substandard. We have, sorry, I'm getting distracted, how to stop my screen. We have been degrading our sidewalk quality where trees are uprooting sidewalks, they're not being repaired. We're shaving the width of sidewalks to build wider roads to accommodate more vehicles. And it's simply not sustainable from a built environment perspective. We cannot expand as a city, we need to grow up. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but transportation, it's important because most of our greenhouse gas emissions, you know, transportation is the single most contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we're not tackling that, we're not doing much to address this issue.
Great, thank you, Alek, for that. The very idea of also linking transportation mitigation to a mobility justice issue. of making sure that people have affordable and easy access to transportation systems to get to work, get to church, to get their children to school and other places. And as you mentioned before, transportation is the single largest contributor to greenhouse gases in California and I believe in the country. But it's also important to also acknowledge that transport emissions from transportation is not just carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, which are global pollutants that don't affect human health, but it emits a lot of the local pollution, the precursors of smog, NOx and SOx that actually affect our health, our respiratory, creates respiratory diseases such as asthma for children and other types of diseases. So the environmental justice movement has long thought, particularly in California, and I talk a lot about in my book, of how do we marry local pollution with global pollution? And that's the fight of making sure that we address carbon reduction at the same time we're reducing emissions that cause smog and affects people's health, and we don't separate them. And long the traditional environmental movement, economists and others have always wanted to separate global and local pollution, but the justice movement, environmental justice movement, has been very successful in trying to marry that. And we have led that here in California. And we see that reflected nationally now in the Biden plan. We've seen it in New York that recently passed statewide legislation and other places. So what does happen in California in the environmental justice movement, as well as our environmental policy movement, has implications for the rest of the country and the world. So Ash, I would like to ask you, what key thing would you like to see change in Glendale to address environmental justice?
Sure. I'm going to piggyback off of what Alek said, because that is a big deal. Being a student, I require, I guess is a good word, to use public transportation, because first of all, I'm low income. I don't have a car. I don't have the funds for a car. And I know that there are so many students just like me. A lot of my friends in high school, we needed to use public transportation to get around in this city. And I have the perspective of someone that just graduated from high school, because I just did. So public transportation is essential. And I feel very fortunate to have to live near a train station where all the buses sort of meet. So I have access to buses and trains so I can get around Los Angeles. However, my perspective of Glendale is that it hasn't really done a great job with providing better routes to get around in Glendale. So for example, I can get to the mall and get to sort of southern Glendale pretty easily using the B line here in Glendale, but I can't get up to northern Glendale in the Montrose area. And I think that sort of plays into line with like this sort of separation of the two parts of the city, and it doesn't provide adequate access to the resources up there, the experiences up there, the things that I could do up there. And I think that it plays into also like limiting our experiences as like youth. So for example, I've had to miss out on certain events that my high school has put on. I've had to miss out on certain sports activities because I couldn't get a ride there, or just in general. Another thing that I think that Glendale can do is it's also housing. It plays into housing here in Glendale because, like we said, this city is very dense, and we tend to see a lot more apartment complexes in southern Glendale than we do in northern Glendale. And I grew up in Highland Park, so I saw a lot of gentrification, and I'm starting to kind of see that a bit here in Glendale. And we see a lot of homes or a lot of apartments being replaced by these newer furnished apartments that are like $2,000, $3,000 per month, and it drives people away, and it sort of plays into that density question, I guess. And also, like someone mentioned in the Q&A about like GCC buying a bunch of homes near the Garfield campus and planning to tear it down and these were affordable apartments, to demolish it and turn it into a parking lot. That's environmental injustice. That's incredibly harmful, especially because I remember a student and my classmate saying that he had to leave Glendale because of how expensive his apartment was. So it plays into a larger picture that I think Glendale, even as a privileged city, needs to look at.
No, thank you. And again, another vote for transportation and that linkage with climate change policy with the idea of mobility justice, making sure individuals have equal access to be able to move freely around their community. And that also goes into the idea of, nobody's mentioned it, a part of environmental justice that has been evolving over the last 2 decades is the idea of intersectionality. Acknowledging is not just race and class of how low-income people of color are being affected, but how other forms of human identity and difference, such as gender or sexuality, ability, impact, and create and exacerbate existing inequalities that these people that are at the intersections of different human identities are experiencing and are intensified with these environmental exposures as well. Well, Tanita, I would like to ask you, what one thing would you like to see change to address environmental justice in Glendale?
Michael, I'm going to name more than one thing.
Okay.
Man, it's so many things. Going back to transportation, in addition to more bike lanes, we need bikes. We need less cars on the streets. We need bikes. We should have other communities have bikes that the community can use. We should have bikes. Glendale is dense, it's growing. It's the 3rd largest city in Los Angeles County. We should have bikes. And then 2, again, going back to what Asha said, we're talking about housing and equity in housing and what that can look like. Not the only way, but one of the major ways that we can change, someone that asked about this in questions about the housing, zoning and housing, and then also about our Glendale council, our city council, our city managers, and the homeowners association. How can we affect? Well, we have to diversify our homeowners association. We have to. If the same people, this is not rocket science. If the same people who are in power or who are making the decisions, who are deciding for our city, if they're going to continue to vote in the interest of the majority of the people who are here, they're going to continue to work in the interest of that's their interest. And if there are people who are continuing to put profit over people, profit over our environment, profit over principle, then, moral values, then we're going to keep getting what we get in Glendale. And that's the reality. And that goes down to even our Glendale Environmental Coalition. All of our coalitions need to diversify. How many Black people do we have? How many Latino people do we have? How many LGBTQ? How many poor? How many people do we have on our Glendale Environmental Coalition to address some of these issues? And I'm not, thank y'all for having me. But we gotta shift. We gotta talk about we gotta do the hard things. If we want, and it's really not that hard. If we want change, we have to change it up. We have to disrupt. We have to do it, not just say it. It sounds good, but we have to do it. We have to move and identify. I said this to you before when we were preparing for this. I saw a meme the other day and it said, if Beyonce can find 15 Black trombone players, the coalition, the city council, the homeowners association can find other people than the majority that have been showing up to help figure out how we can be a better Glendale. And we either want to be a better Glendale or we don't.
Bravo. And I think that's a key strategy that social movements have been putting forward, particularly in the environmental justice movement, this unique and sophisticated inside-outside game, and understanding that you have to be outside protesting and demanding change and marching in the streets, but you also have to have people inside, and you have to demand to occupy those seats at the table, to be on those boards and commissions, be on the planning commission, be on the transportation commission, be on city council, be the state assembly member for the region, and that ensure that you have strong justice-oriented people focused outside and within these power structures. So we have several, we're almost at 4 o'clock, but we have several requests from our audience members if the panelists would indulge for another 10 minutes of answering questions. Can everyone stay for at least 10 more minutes? Okay. All right, let's see another question. Or panelists, did you see any question that you jumped out at you that you want to ask? There was a lot about density and the housing. Why don't we tackle housing and density? Alek, would you like to talk a little bit about why is having a more dense Glendale an environmental justice issue?
I think, I don't know if I can answer that question directly. I think it's important to understand how environmental injustice is manifested in our multifamily areas, and how they differ from single family home neighborhoods. And we talked about this a little bit when it comes to outreach and access. Having, being a government employee, it's important for me to ensure that everybody has equal access to our government. A lot of times we don't know how to engage. We're overwhelmed with information. A lot of it is wonky and we don't understand it. We don't know how to interact with it. And we see that on a daily basis. When I look at, for example, the city planning's website for projects, I could even show it to you right now. I'll be quick, bear with me. Let's see, where is it? Give me a second. I'll try to multitask. We don't know what the city can offer, and that's important. So when the city says they're doing a South Glendale community plan, what the hell does that mean? And I think it's important, and we're at a critical juncture here because we are forming a sustainability commission for the first time ever. And I think these themes that we're talking about today should be at the core of the Sustainability Commission's mission and vision, to partly to raise awareness to these low-income, disenfranchised, disadvantaged communities of our city, to reach out with an olive branch and say, look, these are the things that we're doing. These are the ways in which you can benefit from this process, and make that information available to them. Traditionally, we have HOAs, we have homeowners associations, neighborhood associations. These predominantly exist in single family home areas. So they have the resources, they have the wherewithal, they're obviously more affluent, and they have access to our elected officials. And I do want to say, this is not a criticism to our current elected officials, but we don't have representation in South Glendale where it's majority renters and, low income. And there's a reason for that. Up until very recently, we had elections that were off calendar. They were specific to the city. And the only people that voted were very engaged. Again, we're affluent. And, I managed a campaign in 2015 for a council member who lost in the city of Glendale. And the average age was something ridiculous. It was, I'll just say 60 years old. And it was predominantly in neighborhoods that were single family, white and affluent. And, once you're elected, you only get a stipend. You don't have an income. So you're predisposed to those electeds being independently wealthy. So you're never going to have somebody that's a renter to be a council member because, effectively it is a full-time job. So in many ways, you're not represented. And a lot of those people have won in the past with 10,000 or fewer votes with a city of 200,000 plus people. So the power and the influence on our council was very, very focused to a limited few. Anyway, long story short, I'm hoping the Sustainability Commission and through these conversations that we're having through this panel will shed light on that. You know, there's no single solution, but as Dr. Méndez mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, we need to recognize and acknowledge these injustices first to then begin to tackle, you know, and figure out how we're going to do that. I don't have an answer. I don't think any one of us has the answer, but we're starting to recognize, and the city's making these slow changes in the right direction. And for that, I'm grateful, and we're moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you for that. And then, you know, we don't have the time to talk about this, but the historic issue with redlining and how certain areas were of the history throughout California were redlined racially, like where people could purchase homes, get mortgages, and that it has impacted the way our communities and cities look. There's been great studies that show the overlay between old the redlining zoning maps of where African Americans could live and other Black and brown people live, and then existing environmental pollution. And they basically are overlaid almost perfectly over each other. So that's another form of recognition justice, acknowledging the racial systemic structures within our housing system. Ash, I'd like to maybe pivot. We only got 5 minutes left, but you started your career. You have a great career going for you at the age of 18 as an environmental expert, not just an activist, but an expert. With the Glendale Environmental Coalition, working on the Grayson Power Plant. Could you talk a little bit about how energy justice, the idea of renewable energies and having different forms of clean and renewable energy in Glendale is a justice issue?
Sure. Specifically in Glendale, I think Grayson is a good example because that is, I know that Alek mentioned a bit about it in the beginning, how it isn't like something you can really see. It's mostly just like, it's still not necessarily renewable in its current form, but I think that energy justice plays in many different ways. You can look at it through the 2,500, sorry, I don't know what's going on outside, but the 2,500 feet buffer zones that I'm currently looking at. I know that isn't specific to Glendale, but it is an example of energy justice, of how that specific area of energy has impacted lives and has poisoned water. And I worked on as a volunteer on a campaign with someone who was running in District 64 as a teacher, where she saw her students having their water poisoned and living in areas where they used to have oil drilling. And it sort of reminds me a bit of Glendale, but not specifically. However, I know that, you know, our choices, or at least city council's choices, are really influential. So they had a choice, I think earlier or last year, to make the public transportation green, or is it, I think it was sourced with renewable energy rather than fossil fuels. And they decided, no, not Glendale water, sorry, I'm saying in a different area of Los Angeles, I was just referencing. But that is a choice of where energy justice plays into it. And that's sort of an example that I know of. But, and I know that even with the current plan for Grayson, it was mostly targeted towards single homes, I think, right? I don't know if that's, I'd have to double check that, but it plays into that. And I know that when I was a fellow on a campaign here in Glendale, we talked about even like stoves and how that plays into energy justice, because most of them are powered with fossil fuels, and making that choice to move as a city to renewable energy in that form. So.
No, great, thank you. No, Having renewable and diverse energy systems has multiple implications for our community. You mentioned about the oil production. So a lot of our power plants are running on fossil fuels. I live in Long Beach. There's oil rigs in low-income communities throughout Long Beach, Signal Hill, throughout Los Angeles. And they're pumping oil to support this sort of fossil fuel type of energy. But people living next to these oil rigs are suffering various forms of health conditions, cancers, living in such close proximity. And another energy justice issue is also access to affordable forms of energy. As our changing climate, as it becomes hot. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, so I'm very familiar with Glendale and how hot it gets in Glendale. Triple-digit heats throughout the summer, even in September and sometimes in October now. That's creating huge costs to households, to low-income households, and having more reliable energy that doesn't go out and leave families without energy during brownouts or blackouts, as they call them, and ensuring that there's more affordable options that are affordable and sustainable. And so to end our discussion today, Tanita, I was wondering if you can talk to us. We had a great conversation yesterday about symbols and imagery of climate change and the environmental movement, of how do we make climate change more real and relatable to the local community, to a resident, to the mother that has 2 jobs and that's trying to just get food on her table. How can we make environmental issues a priority for her?
We make it a priority for her and anybody else who seems apathetic, because part of it is the conditioning. We've been conditioned to believe that environmental justice. I have the husband and 3 children and 2 kids in college, but I didn't realize how much what's happening in the environment impacted me outside of, like I said, feeding the wells. That was important. So number one, I'm going to say that mobilization is important. Coalition building is important. This coalition, the Coalition for Equity and Justice in Glendale, these coalitions are important because the coalitions allow us to come together and say, this is what's happening, this is what's wrong, calling out the people who are in charge and the people who are representing, who we have voted or elected to represent us. Is important to call them out and to be direct and to ask, request, and insist that they meet our needs with a sense of urgency. So I think that's great, Alek, that you said it's nice and the city is doing what they can, and they're not moving fast enough as far as I'm concerned. So there needs to be a sense of urgency, and it can be done. So we need to, and then the other part is not doing things the way we've been doing it. It's wonderful, you send out a pamphlet, I said this to Kathy before, it has all these words on it, and that's not what we're conditioned to do anymore. Turn it into something that people can see outright. You got 3 seconds to get my attention about a situation. If you get my attention, if you call me on the phone, the first thing I want to know in those first 5 seconds is, what do you want? And what can I do about it? And that's what we need to do. We need to be more direct. I'm sure Ash can talk about what the young people can do. That's the most important thing that we can do, is we can change our old ways of doing things and stop saying, well, this is how we've been doing it. Get to it, meet it with a sense of urgency, coalition build, and be direct and succinct in delivering the message.
Great, no, that's great advice. And also want to reiterate too is our governments building the relationships, going out to the community, talking to community leaders, talking to people that they normally don't speak to, and making that effort to build relationships. Because you also see on the other end where policymakers have urgency, and that those urgencies and priorities don't align with the community. And there's a great saying that urban planners have, that cities and governments should move with the speed of trust. And that trust is built on building those relationships and those connections that you're talking about. So thank you. And our portion of the Q&A, and I just want to thank you for the honor to help moderate and to listen to some of the great expertise and perspectives that you all brought to the conversation. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it over back to Jane, who will conclude our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here this evening and for taking part in this vital discussion. Thank you, panel, for your insights and for sharing your invaluable personal experience. And thank you, Dr. Méndez, for steering this conversation. We are grateful to you all for bringing to light how we as a community can be more aware of how environmental racism manifests in our own city, as well as the work that we need to do to achieve climate justice. And thank you again to all of our co-sponsors for supporting this event and to all the attendees for coming to this afternoon's discussion. It's our sincere hope that this event is only the first of many discussions to be had on this critical topic. Awareness is the first step to change. If you haven't yet, we'd like to invite you all to please take a moment to fill out GEC's short survey on environmental justice. Glendale will be developing an environmental justice planning document soon, and it's important for it to reflect the concerns of our community rather than just the government's perspective. So we have created the survey to hopefully hear from a wide spectrum of Glendale's population. Also, this information will help shape how GEC continues its efforts in serving our community. We would greatly appreciate it if you would share it on your social media for local friends and neighbors to take part as well. The link to the survey is in the chat, and we'll be sending a follow-up email with the survey link and more information about Dr. Méndez's book as well. We'd also like to invite you to join GEC or sign up for our mailing list, and the email will have that information too. We welcome your suggestions and ideas on ways we can continue this conversation, so feel free to reach out to us anytime, and we hope you'll join us for future events. Thank you again for joining us today. Stay safe and be well.